Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is, and welcome. I'm Larry Erickson. This is the Erickson Report. And welcome to our first show of 2023. And I'm actually going to start by spending some time this episode on two issues that I think will be continuing to be big issues across the whole of the year. So we'll start by noting that we are now, as of today, just 6 weeks short of the anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I tell you at the top that I have a great fear that a year from now I can be sitting here saying exactly the same thing. Soaking up the sunshine of recent gains, Ukrainian officials have talked about looking forward to a year of victories. But in fact, there seems little sign of any actual victory for either side in this. There's still a great deal of firepower around to be directed against various targets, including human flesh. And neither side shows any particular interest in putting an end to this short of total victory. I mean, consider, for example, Russia's demands for peace. One is the denazification of Ukraine, whatever the hell that's supposed to mean, which nobody seems to know, including Russia. But more importantly, demands that Ukraine accept, quote, the new territorial realities, unquote, meaning Russia keeping the four regions, Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk, that Putin unilaterally annexed in September. The other thing is, quote, the elimination of threats to Russia's security emanating from Ukraine, apparently including an end to NATO, that is no NATO in Ukraine, and the demilitarization of Ukraine. These terms come coupled with a threat from Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who said that Ukraine needs to accept these terms or the issue will be decided by the Russian military. As for Ukraine, the government has said that, it's willing to talk at some kind of peace summit, provided that Russia is first facing a war crimes tribunal before an international court. In other words, a war crimes tribunal is a precondition for talking about peace. They also demand total withdrawal of Russian forces from all of Ukraine, including Crimea, which was seized by Russia back in 2014, 8 years before the war started. And that's an idea that seems so far from the Russian way of thinking that they didn't even mention it in their demands. Plus, they say that Russia must be actively punished for the war, including further economic sanctions, being stripped from a position as a permanent member of the Security Council. And there have to be security guarantees for Ukraine, and the world must unite to prevent Russia from engaging in armed aggression at any time in the future. In other words, what Volodymyr Zelensky calls a just peace amounts to no compromises, punishment, war crimes tribunals, reparations, and the crippling of the Russian military. It's really hard to find any kind of overlap in those two positions, those two sets. So despite talk about turning points and critical times, I frankly see no reason to think that this is not going to continue for at least several months and probably longer. Now, at this point, though, it's something that deeply concerns me, is what is the end goal here? What's the end? Now, for Russia, the end goal is clear, obtaining the whole of the Donbass region, keeping Crimea, and keeping Ukraine out of NATO. But what about Ukraine? What is the end goal? Is there an end goal beyond driving Russia out of Ukraine? And if so, what is it? Now, Zelensky wants the West to support the war against Russia. And up to the point where Russia either is driven out of Ukraine or agrees to leave, the West is clearly on board with that. That's clearly the West's intent. The question is, will that be enough? Zelensky has increasingly referred to Russia as a terrorist state and its leaders as terrorists, and talks about the final defeat of the terrorist nation. Would a withdrawal constitute a final defeat? And if not, what would? All this sincerely gives me cause to wonder, to worry about what goes beyond the immediate issue. A.J. Muste, he was a leader in both the labor and peace movements in the United States in the first half of the 20th century. He once said the problem with war is not the loser, but with the winner. Who teaches the winner that might does not make right? So we actually have to think, is that going to be a problem? It's a question we need to ask. So I suggest it's actually time for some secret messages, that kind of really secret backdoor third-party diplomacy of the kind that most of the rest of us don't even know about until a deal is reached, till after the fact. For example, we should do that with Zelensky and say to him that there's this old saying that if you don't want a war, you have to give the other side a way to back out without appearing to back down. Well, to end a war, it applies in a similar way. Unless you're just demanding absolute surrender, if you want to end a war, you have to give the other side a way to stand down without appearing to kneel down. So the question is, what would you be willing to give up to accomplish that? What face-saving accommodation would you be willing to give Putin in order to give him a way to claim enough of a victory to justify politically justify a military withdrawal from Ukraine? Putin should get the same sort of message. What do you need? What's the minimum you need to claim a sufficient victory? And don't give us this denazification stuff. That's bull, and you know it. Don't give us, new territorial realities. That's also PR, and you know it. I mean, we're prepared to see this through. You have to, at this point, know that we are prepared to see this through. And we're prepared to give you a way out, but you have to tell us what it is. And at this point, if neither side is willing to budge, even in secret, on their demands, then yes, we probably should consider what kind of support we're prepared to give, how much, and for how long. Finally on this, some observations on two connected points. One, Mikhail Podolyak, he's an aide to Zelensky. In response to Putin's announcement of a 13-hour truce over Orthodox Christmas, he called it hypocrisy and said, quoting, "Ukraine doesn't attack foreign territory and doesn't kill civilians." And when I read that, I thought, wait a minute, really? I mean, Ukraine has launched artillery attacks on towns that were then held by Russian forces. Are you going to seriously tell us that no civilians were killed in any of those attacks? Now, I'm prepared to think that what he actually meant was that Ukraine doesn't intentionally target civilians, which Russia clearly has, and that would definitely be a defensible position for Ukraine. But it's not what he said. And the thing is, because of course civilians were killed. I mean, this is war. Civilians die in war. Okay? An old friend of mine, he was a Quaker pacifist I knew a number of years ago. He said that, quite sagely, that when you buy war, you buy the whole package. You don't get to pick and choose parts like it's off a menu. When you buy war, you buy the whole package. And among that is that civilians die and atrocities are committed. Atrocities are committed in war by all sides, including your own. In fact, Andrew Milburn, he's a retired U.S. Marine colonel who spent several months in Ukraine training Ukrainian forces. He said during a recent interview that while most of those forces were professional, he did see some commit atrocities, which he called atrocities. He actually specifically referred to killing Russian troops who had surrendered, killing captives. That reference to atrocities raises the connected point, which is something that Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky called manufacturing consent. Now, this article where I read this came from Newsweek. And that same Newsweek article, the one that reported it, not only actively played down the accusation about atrocities, emphasizing rather the mostly professional part and the fact that Milburn still supports Ukraine, which he does, but it actively played down the accusation and also quoted Max Blumenthal, founder of the podcast where Milburn made the statement, as suggesting that Milburn was drunk at the time. So it gave him a much darker view of what he saw. In other words, yeah, we have to report that he said it because he said it, but other things, and he was probably drunk, so don't pay any attention. At the same time, we have pundits exhuming the decomposing corpse of the domino theory, arguing that unless Putin is driven out of Ukraine entirely, every inch, he will move on then to trying to grab parts of other countries, figuring I can get away with this. In other words, what would amount to, in the eyes of the world, no matter how many fig leaves he could put on to cover it up, it would amount in the eyes of the world of an embarrassing, costly failure in Ukraine. Would actually make him more likely to invade other countries. And it's not just there. It's not in cases like the mass media and so on. Even significant portions of the progressive, or at least supposedly progressive left, are doing the same thing. Now, note here, this is important. I'm not talking about the idea of supporting Ukraine. I mean, the left may be interested in peace, but it's not pacifist. So the idea of military support to Ukraine and supporting Ukraine, that's pretty much goes without saying. What I'm questioning is the unquestioning support, the undying support, the buying into the whole pure good Ukraine versus pure evil Russia line that's being peddled. It allows for no nuance whatsoever. I mentioned before, in fact, how there's one major lefty site that smears anyone even raising a vague question about the war, even about just some practicalities, but especially anyone who even in the gentlest way dares to ask if the pain and suffering and destruction that are still to come would be worth that price for whatever would be gained by it. Those sort of people asking the gentlest questions about people who wonder about gains and losses, who actually look at war's balance sheet. Those people are smeared as tankies, which is a derogatory term that was originally directed against those people who continued to support the Soviet Union after its invasion of Hungary, in 1954. That is, what is ultimately being said here is that if you question in any way the ultimate justice, the ultimate righteousness of this war, well, you're a communist. You're on Putin's side. You support the invasion. You hate freedom. Several years ago, there was a T-shirt that I used to wear. It was one of my favorites. It said on the front, "I'm already against the next war." And that was one of those popular T-shirts I ever wore. It probably got more favorable comments than any other T-shirt I've ever worn. I haven't worn it for a few years because, it was old, it got ragged. So I haven't worn it. Not even sure I still have it. But I sincerely wonder what would happen if I was to wear that same T-shirt today. Because everybody is always against the next war until it actually happens. And then dare to ask questions about it. We're taking a break. And we are back with another major issue that I think will continue to be a major issue throughout the course of the year, and that is the overall concern about bodily autonomy, within which lies the issue of reproductive rights, and within that lies the specific issue of access to abortion. And on that latter front, there is in fact some good news. On January 3rd, the FDA announced that resale pharmacies will be allowed to dispense mifepristone to people with a prescription. Previously, had to get it directly from a doctor or by mail order. Now, mifepristone, also known as RU46, is typically used to bring about a medical abortion. Used in combination with misoprostol, it's 97% effective during the first 9 weeks of pregnancy and is effective even into the second trimester. Walgreens and CVS have said they plan to offer mifepristone in their retail stores in states where it's legal. Now, other major chains, such as Rite Aid, Walmart, Kroger's, Albertsons, Costco, they were non-committal on this. And the fact is, a pharmacy has to get FDA certified to carry mifepristone, which may be too high a barrier for some, like, locally owned, individually owned local pharmacies. So it may only be available through the national chains. But still, this is part of the admirable effort by the Biden administration to try to keep access to abortion as wide and as available as it can after Roe was overturned. Related to that idea, on December 5th, the DOJ announced that the USPS, the Postal Service, can deliver mifepristone and misoprostol even to states where they are illegal, because the DOJ said the Postal Service cannot decide that the meds would be used illegally. All right, some more good news. On January 4th, the South Carolina Supreme Court struck down on the state's ban of abortion after 6 weeks. It ruled the new restriction violates a state constitutional right to privacy. This 3-2 decision comes nearly 2 years after the restriction was enacted, which banned abortions after the detection of cardiac activity. And by the way, this is another right-wing lie. What they are calling cardiac activity is not that by any standard or rational medical definition. There is no pumping going on here, no blood being moved. What you're seeing is the first activity of cells that are going to form the heart. It's just another lie. All right, one more bit of good news, though. In at least 5 states, Indiana, Kentucky, Utah, Wyoming, and Florida, suits have been filed against those states' restrictions on abortion, arguing, at least in part, that those restrictions violate the religious freedom of the plaintiffs. For example, under Jewish law, a fetus becomes a person only at birth, and throughout the pregnancy, the interests of the woman supersede those of the fetus. Some of these suits are also arguing that the very notion that life begins at conception is a theological Christian view, not a medical or scientific one, and therefore that very concept violates religious freedom. Specifically in the Indiana case, I love this. On December 2nd, Marion County Judge Heather Welch ruled that the state's ban violates the state's religious freedom law, which was signed into law in 2015 by then-Governor Mike Pence. File that one under Turnabout is Fair Play. I wish all related news on this topic was as good as that. 12 states have banned abortion and 10 more have severely restricted access. And the thing is, I wanted to raise that in addition to that direct impact, there is another longer-term danger, which hasn't been talked about much. Roe's overturning has spurred more doctors to seek abortion training, but because of the restrictions, fewer and fewer places are able to offer it. A study published last year in the medical journal Obstetrics and Gynecology estimated that without Roe, roughly 44% of the OBGYN interns in hospitals in the United States would lose access to in-state training in abortion procedures. It does no good to have access to a medical procedure if there's no one around that knows how to do it. Meanwhile, Texas Republicans, always striving to have their state being number one in denying access to health care. I mean, they still refuse to do expansion of Medicaid, for Pete's sake. They're preparing to introduce a bill that would require internet providers in the state to block access to abortion pill websites, comparing them to child porn. Now, beyond the fact that managing your own abortion with medication is not illegal, unlike child porn, even anti-abortion lawyers say that that would be a significant threat to free speech rights. But of course, the free government of free Texas doesn't care about freedom for anyone except their free, bigoted selves. Also in Texas, the last week of December, federal district court judge Matthew Kaczmarek for the District for Northern Texas upheld a Texas law that says that teens have to have parental consent to obtain birth control. The thing is, there's a federal law known as Title 10, which has been in place for 52 years now, which includes guarantees of free and confidential contraception to anyone, regardless of age, income, or immigration status. Kaczmarek didn't care. So what Kaczmarek did here is not only disregard long-standing court rulings that parents do not have a constitutional right to target government programs providing birth control, he ignored the base legal and constitutional idea that state law cannot overrule federal law. What's more, he has a history of working as a religious liberty lawyer, including working on cases seeking to overturn protection for contraception services. Exactly the same sort of issues that were raised in this case, and despite that, he did not recuse himself. The state of Texas ranks 9th in the nation in the teen birth rate and 2nd in the rate of repeat teen births. Apparently, those rankings are not high enough for Matthew Kaczmarek. Now, one of the things that established a right to birth control is what's called substantive due process, which brings me to the next point. In his concurrence on the radical Supreme Court decision that overturned Roe, Clarence Thomas said that one reason was that Roe relied on substantive due process, which he called a legal fiction, on the grounds that the Constitution only guarantees process of law. It actually says due process of law, but never mind. So he's saying that means that as long as there is a law that says this is how we do it, it's all okay. But the idea of substantive due process is that the term due process alone means nothing unless it's effective, unless it's meaningful, unless it's substantial. So if the process involved unfairly burdens the person pursuing it, if it's in some way incompatible with their rights, then it's not due process in any meaningful sense of the term. But Justice Clarence Thomas said it's a legal fiction. So he says in future cases, the court should reconsider all of its substantive due process precedents. And he cited 3. Griswold v. Connecticut, this was from 1965. This is a decision that said that married couples had a right to have contraception. It wasn't even unmarried. That comes later in a case called Eisenstadt v. Baird. But that married people had a right under a constitutional notion of privacy to get contraception. And in fact, this case is really what established the notion of privacy as a constitutional concept. He also cited Lawrence v. Texas, which is 2003, and concluded that consensual non-procreative sex between adults is not a crime. And the third one was, of course, Obergefell v. Hodges, the one that established, that was in 2015, and said same-sex marriage. Interestingly, a case that he did not cite, which relied at least in part on substantive due process, was Loving v. Virginia, which was in 1967 and struck down remaining barriers against interracial marriage, the kind that he is in, so that the one he didn't mention is the one that would affect him. The point here is that having already enabled recriminalizing abortion, Thomas would re-enable banning same-sex marriage, re-enable banning criminalizing gay sex, re-enable recriminalizing birth control. All these rights are now at risk. And if you think that's ridiculous, if you think that's an overstatement, think just how long ago it was, because it wasn't that long ago that it seemed ridiculous to think the same thing about abortion. But even more immediate here to the issue of bodily autonomy. It's another right connected to that issue, and another issue which actually shares many of the same players as the battle over reproductive rights. And that is the right of LGBTQ plus people, particularly at the moment transgender people, and more particularly at the moment transgender youth, to be who they are, the right to be who they are, indeed to even have their right to exist. Now, I predicted it, I said it, and we're seeing it. More and more stories about transition regret and detransitioning. People claiming that they only transitioned as the result of pressure from peers, parents, or physicians. We have stories of gender-related surgeries, like a double mastectomy on a 16-year-old, something I think should raise a call for that doctor to be brought up in ethics charges rather than a call for banning affirmative health care for transgender youth. But, that wouldn't be as politically useful, would it? There was a paper, in fact, claiming that transgender teens were suffering from something called rapid onset gender dysphoria. That is, that they were trans because of peer pressure and media promotion. Now, that paper got slapped down quite quickly, with the author having to admit that there is no such condition, and the whole thing is just her opinion with neither clinical experience or evidence to back it up. But that hasn't stopped the idea that being transgender is just a fad, that it's not real, that they are not real, from being referenced in right-wing circles and media. Meanwhile, the bigoted right continues its attacks on children, concealing those attacks under the lie of protecting them. Just 1 week into 2023, state legislatures already planning to consider more than 24 bills aiming to cut off transgender access to health care. Lawmakers in Texas have filed 10 anti-transgender bills, including a proposal to make gender-affirming care for minors a second-degree felony for the physicians providing them, and categorizing the prescription of hormonal therapy for minors with gender dysphoria as child abuse, thereby targeting the physicians and the parents. Both Oklahoma and Arizona lawmakers will consider legislation requiring school staff to effectively misgender trans and non-binary students by requiring them to be referred to by the name and sex on their birth certificate, unless parents provide written permission, written directions to do it otherwise. Lawmakers in Kansas, Kentucky, Missouri, Montana, New Hampshire, Tennessee, Utah, Virginia are also considering restrictions on health care for transgender people in their upcoming sessions. And by the way, it's not even just transgender youth we're talking about here. Republicans in South Carolina have proposed banning gender-affirming care for anybody under 21, or in fact 21 or younger, I should say. And one bill to be introduced in Oklahoma would ban all gender-affirming surgery for anyone up to the age of 26. The previously purely hypothetical escalation of transition bans from childhood into adulthood is already underway. But this has been the pattern. This business has been the pattern. In 2018 and 2019 together, there were 44 anti-trans bills introduced in state legislatures. In 2020, there were 60. In 2021, there were 131. And as of October 13th, 2022, which is the point at which the Washington Post reported on this, there were already 155. Now, to be clear, most of these bills have failed. Most of them have failed. In the words of Vivian Topping, Director of Advocacy and Civic Engagement at the Equality Federation, quoting her, "The one thing that we do know is that when we have shown up in state capitals, we have been able to beat these bills." Frankly, I actually wonder if a lot of the sponsors of these bills actually want them to pass, because if they did, they couldn't come back the next year and again rant and rave about, oh my God, the children. And I think that a lot of them just are happy to have these bills used as a political prop, just the latest way to rouse the rubes. But although only 39 of the 390 bills proposed introduced have actually passed, their impact on trans lives is considerable. Not only just bathrooms or school sports, but right on up through healthcare to their very right to be allowed to exist in the eyes of the law and society. This threat is real and it is ongoing, and yes, escalating, because as Clarence Darrow famously said, fanaticism and ignorance is forever busy and needs feeding. That's it. We are out of here. We will see you in 2 weeks. Have the best 2 weeks you possibly can. And as always, peace.